Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where your weather app would just display a skull emoji for 7 straight months. You wake up in October 1880 in De Smet, Dakota Territory. Your house is basically a wooden box on an endless prairie. Your heating system is a wood stove that eats fuel like your car eats gas during a road trip. And breakfast? Well, spoiler alert. You'll be grinding wheat in a coffee mill like some kind of pioneer barista by February. So yeah, you probably won't survive this either. But before you get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink and dim the lights, because we're about to walk through the winter that made every other bad winter look like a mild inconvenience. Drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I love knowing who else is discovering just how soft our modern lives really are. Now settle in, because the long winter of 1880 to 1881 wasn't just bad weather. It was nature's way of asking settlers, are you absolutely sure about this whole frontier thing? You wake up on October 15th, 1880, and the air tastes wrong. Not like something's burning in the kitchen wrong, but like nature just broke its own rules wrong. Yesterday you were picking the last vegetables from your garden, in shirt sleeves. Today you're watching snowfall like the sky is having a panic attack. Listen to the wind picking up outside your thin wooden walls. It sounds like a freight train that's lost its way and decided to circle your house forever. The temperature has dropped 40 degrees since yesterday, and your body is experiencing the meteorological equivalent of whiplash. Here's a fun historical fact. October blizzards east of the Rockies are rarer than honest politicians. Your neighbours are standing at their windows with the same expression people get when their Wi-Fi goes down during a Netflix binge. Confusion mixed with growing dread. The snow isn't the gentle Instagram-worthy kind either. This is angry snow, driven horizontal by the winds that sound like they're personally offended by your decision to live here. Each flake hits your window like a tiny frozen middle finger from Mother Nature herself. You might think you're prepared because you've got a root cellar and some preserved food. Congratulations, you've planned for a normal winter. This is like bringing a butter knife to a gunfight, except the gunfight lasts 7 months and the bullets are made of ice. The blizzard isn't just weather, it's a preview. Nature is showing you the trailer for the horror movie you're about to live through. And unlike Netflix, you can't turn this off when it gets too intense. Your cattle are huddled together like they're forming a support group. The chickens have that look animals get when they sense an earthquake coming, except this earthquake is made of wind and snow, and it's going to last until spring. But here's what you don't realise yet. Staring out at that first impossible October blizzard, this isn't the main event. This is just nature clearing its throat before the real performance begins. The long winter is warming up and you're about to learn why Laura Ingalls Wilder's family story became legendary. Feel the cold seeping through your window glass and remember that central heating won't exist for another 50 years. Your wood stove is about to become more important to your survival than food itself. The wind carries sounds that don't belong in October, the creaking of tree branches under snow loads they weren't ready for, the sharp crack of wood contracting in sudden cold, and underneath it all, a silence that feels like the world holding its breath before something terrible happens. Your thermometer reads numbers that make you check it twice, convinced it must be broken. 24 hours ago, it was reading pleasant autumn temperatures. Now it's showing numbers more appropriate for January in the Arctic, as if someone has secretly relocated your entire town to Siberia without bothering to mention it. The animals know something you don't. Watch how they move, with the careful urgency of creatures whose survival instincts are screaming warnings that their human caretakers are too civilized to hear. Your dog isn't playing in the snow like dogs in Christmas movies. He's moving like he understands that playtime has been cancelled indefinitely. You wake up 3 days later and the world has disappeared. Where there used to be a railroad track, there's now just a white wasteland that looks like someone took a giant eraser to civilization itself. The snow has drifted 20 feet high in some places, creating walls that would make medieval castle builders jealous. The morning train was supposed to arrive yesterday. Then this morning. Now you're starting to realise it might not come at all. Listen to the silence where the train whistle should be. It's the sound of your town being cut off from the rest of humanity. Here's what's happening that you can't see. 20 miles east, a locomotive is buried so deep in snow that only the smokestack is visible, like some kind of industrial gravestone. The railroad crews are looking at the drifts and making the same face you make when you see your student loan balance. Your general store owner is doing math that would make an accountant cry. He's calculating how long his supplies will last if no trains come through. Spoiler alert, not nearly long enough. The shelves that were full of canned goods last week now look like they're on a very strict diet. You venture outside and immediately understand why polar bears have so much fur. The wind cuts through your coat like it's made of tissue paper. Walking to your barn feels like crossing the Sahara. Except instead of dying of heat, you're collecting icicles in places you didn't know could form icicles. The snow isn't just deep, it's architectural. The wind has carved it into shapes that look like frozen waves. Some drifts are hard packed enough to walk on. Others will swallow you up to your chest like quicksand made of ice crystals. Your neighbours are starting to eye their woodpiles with the intensity of people checking their phone battery during a power outage. Everyone's doing mental math, and the equations all end with question marks that taste like fear. But here's the thing about October 1880. This blizzard was supposed to be a freak occurrence, a one-time weather tantrum that everyone would laugh about come spring. The railroad companies sent out press releases basically saying, "Don't worry, we'll have this cleaned up in a few days." Nature was reading those press releases and laughing like a supervillain, because this wasn't a freak occurrence. This was the opening act of the most brutal winter in American frontier history. The telegraph lines are down, which means your town is as isolated as a space station. Except astronauts have better supply chains. You're about to learn what self-sufficient really means, and spoiler alert, it's going to involve a lot more hunger than your Instagram survivalist fantasies ever included. The railroad cut, that deep channel carved through the prairie to keep the tracks level, has become a snow trap that defies all lower logic. It's like nature designed a perfect funnel to collect every snowflake within a 5-mile radius and deposit it precisely where it would cause maximum transportation disruption. The irony is sharp enough to cut glass. The engineering that was supposed to make train travel reliable has created the perfect conditions for making train travel impossible. Your town's connection to the outside world wasn't just convenient, it was essential. Every week, that train brought flour, coal, canned goods, medicine, mail, and news from the civilized world. Now you're learning the difference between a frontier town and a frontier settlement, and the difference is a functioning railroad. You walk to your barn and your horse looks at you like you've personally betrayed him. His eyes have that expression people get when they realise their optimistic vacation weather app was completely wrong. The animals gathered closer together than usual, and they're not doing it for Instagram photos. Listen to how quiet the birds have become. The ones that haven't already fled south are huddled in whatever shelter they can find, looking like feathered refugees from a disaster movie. Even the prairie dogs have essentially posted "closed until further notice" signs on their burrows. Your cattle are standing with their backs to the wind in that universal animal pose that means this is not good. They've developed the 1,000-yard stare of creatures who've seen the weather forecast written in their DNA and realise they're about to become part of a survival statistics. Here's a fringe historical fact. Native American tribes had been predicting this winter for months. They'd seen the signs in animal behaviour, plant growth patterns, and weather indicators that white settlers dismissed as folklore. The irony is thicker than the snowdrifts. The people who'd lived on these plains for centuries tried to warn the newcomers, but nobody listens to indigenous weather prediction when you've got European confidence. Your chickens have formed what can only be described as a feathered depression support group. They're huddled together, making sounds that would be familiar to anyone who's ever been stuck in an airport during a storm cancellation. It's the universal sound of creatures realising they're at the mercy of forces completely beyond their control. The barn cats, normally independent to the point of arrogance, are suddenly your best friends. They're following you around like furry insurance policies, having apparently decided that humans represent their best chance of surviving whatever fresh hell is coming. You might notice your dog isn't acting like his usual enthusiastic self. He's not bounding through the snow like dogs do in Christmas movies. Instead, he's moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knows the game has changed and the rules haven't been explained yet. But here's what the animals understand that you don't. This isn't just bad weather. This is the beginning of a winter that will test every survival instinct evolution has programmed into living creatures. The animals are preparing like they're about to enter hibernation mode, except you don't have that option. Your milk cow's production has already started dropping, not because she's sick, but because her body is automatically switching to survival mode. She's essentially telling you, "I'm going to need all my energy for myself, thanks." The real kicker? The animal's behaviour is based on instincts developed over thousands of years of living through winters exactly like this one. They know what's coming because their ancestors lived through it. Your ancestors, meanwhile, were dealing with nice, civilised European winters that were basically extended full seasons compared to what you're about to experience. The geese that usually stick around until November have already vanished like they received an urgent evacuation notice. The rabbits have disappeared so completely you wonder if they've learned to teleport. Even the mice in your grain storage seem to have packed up and moved somewhere with better long-term prospects. Your livestock are conserving energy in ways that would impress efficiency experts. They're moving only when absolutely necessary, clustering together for warmth, and eating with the methodical determination of creatures who understand that calories equal survival and entertainment is a luxury they can't afford. You wake up in mid-November, and for one glorious moment you think the universe has apologised for that October nightmare. The sun is shining, the air feels almost warm against your face, and you can actually see the ground again in some places. This is what Laura called Indian summer, and it feels like nature's way of saying just kidding about that whole apocalyptic blizzard thing. Your neighbours are outside like people emerging from bomb shelters, blinking in the sunlight and trying to convince themselves that October was just a weather hiccup. Everyone's suddenly optimistic again, making plans like they're booking summer vacation during a brief Wi-Fi connection. Listen to the sound of melting snow dripping from your roof. It's like nature's version of a false alarm, that moment when you think the fire drill is over, but it's actually just the calm before the building actually catches fire. Here's a historical reality check. November 1880 in the Dakota Territory was actually the coldest November on record in places like Omaha. What felt warm to you was still brutally cold by normal standards. You've just been recalibrated by October's frozen slap in the face. You're probably using this warm spell to stockpile more wood and check your food supplies. Smart move, except it's like buying extra phone chargers when the power grid is about to fail for 6 months. Helpful, but not nearly enough. The false warmth is doing something cruel to your psychology. It's giving you hope, which in this situation is like offering someone a life preserver made of concrete. You start thinking maybe the old-timers were wrong about this being a bad winter. Maybe it was just one freak storm. Your animals are confused too. The chickens are venturing outside like tourists who've misread the weather forecast. The cattle are acting almost normal, which would be comforting if you didn't have the growing suspicion that normal was about to become a forgotten concept. But here's what's really happening. This warm spell is nature's version of a fake-out. It's like when a horror movie goes quiet right before the jump scare. The atmospheric pressure systems are reorganising themselves for a winter-long siege that will make October look like a gentle spring shower. You might catch yourself actually enjoying the weather, maybe even going outside without 3 layers of clothing. This is the meteorological equivalent of that moment in zombie movies when everything seems fine right before the horde arrives. The telegraph lines got fixed during this warm spell, so you're getting news from the outside world again. Reports are saying this was just an early storm. Nothing to worry about. The railroad companies are confident they'll maintain service all winter. You're reading these reports with the same optimism people have when they check their bank balance after a shopping spree. People are actually talking about Thanksgiving plans, Christmas preparations, and spring planting like these are reasonable things to discuss. The general store owner is taking orders for holiday goods, and everyone's acting like supply chains are a reliable concept rather than a fragile system that just demonstrated its vulnerability. Your husband is splitting wood with renewed energy, but you notice he's splitting a lot more than usual for this time of year. He's not saying anything about his concerns, but his axe is having very detailed conversations with every log about the importance of being prepared for situations that might be worse than they appear. You wake up on December 1st and immediately know that November was just winter's way of lulling you into a false sense of security. The cold hits you like stepping into a walk-in freezer, except walk-in freezers have the courtesy to warm up when you leave. This temperature has dropped so fast it's like someone switched the planet's thermostat from uncomfortable to actively hostile to human life. Your breath turns to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth, creating your own personal fog machine made of frozen despair. Listen to your house, settling in the cold. The wood is contracting with sounds like rifle shots, as if your home is slowly giving up on the concept of warmth altogether. Every nail, every board, every shingle is surrendering to the cold with audible protests. Here's the thing about December 1880. This wasn't gradual cooling. This was nature throwing a switch from manageable to why did anyone think living here was a good idea? The temperature drop was so severe that people's thermometers actually broke, which is the 1880s equivalent of your weather app just displaying error messages. Your wood stove is now running constantly, consuming fuel like a desperate gambler feeding coins into a slot machine. You're learning the hard way that heating a wooden box on an open prairie requires approximately all the wood in the territory. The wind has developed personality traits, and they're all unpleasant. It's persistent like a door-to-door salesman, cutting like a critic reviewing a bad movie, and cold like your ex's heart. Every time you open your door, it rushes in like it's been waiting outside specifically to ruin your day. You venture to your barn and realise that the 50-foot walk might as well be a polar expedition. You can't see your own feet through the blowing snow, and the wind is strong enough to make you question your fundamental understanding of which direction is forward. Your animals have officially entered survival mode. The chickens look like they're holding a funeral for the concept of warm weather. Your milk cow has the expression of someone who's just realised they're trapped in an elevator with people they don't like for an indefinite period. But here's what you don't know yet. December is still being polite. It's still following the rules of normal winter behaviour. The real long winter hasn't even started flexing yet. This is just winter putting on its work clothes and cracking its knuckles. You're probably thinking this is as bad as it gets. You're wrong with the confidence of someone who thinks they've found the worst restaurant in town, unaware that there's an entire district of worse restaurants they haven't discovered yet. The water in your wash basin freezes solid overnight, even though it's sitting next to the stove. You wake up to find ice crystals forming on the inside of your windows, creating artistic patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't evidence that your house is losing the battle against physics. Your daily routine has been simplified to a series of thermal management decisions. Do you put on another layer before going outside, or save it for later, when it gets even colder? Do you add wood to the fire now, or try to stretch what you have until the temperature becomes genuinely life-threatening? You wake up on Christmas morning and realise that Santa's sleigh would need snow chains and a GPS to find your house. What was supposed to be a day of celebration has turned into another episode of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? It's another blizzard. The storm started on Christmas Eve like the world's most unwelcome holiday guest. Instead of carolers at your door, you've got wind howling down your chimney like it's trying to sing Silent Night in a voice that could shatter glass. Listen to the silence between wind gusts. It's the kind of quiet that makes you check if your ears are still working. Then the next gust hits and reminds you that Mother Nature is not interested in your holiday spirit. Your Christmas dinner was supposed to be special, but special has been redefined as anything that isn't hardtack and despair. The turkey you were planning to cook is now more valuable than currency, assuming you can keep it from freezing solid in your kitchen. Here's a historical gift nobody wanted. This Christmas blizzard of 1880 dumped snow for 3 straight days. It wasn't the gentle Hallmark movie snow that makes everything look picturesque. This was aggressive snow that fell like it had a personal vendetta against visibility. You might have been planning to visit neighbours for holiday celebrations. Those plans are now as dead as your optimism about this winter ending anytime soon. Your nearest neighbour might as well be on another planet, because the distance between houses has been multiplied by the snow depth. The presents you ordered by mail aren't coming either. The trains are stuck somewhere east of here, buried under snow like expensive locomotive-shaped fossils. Your gifts are technically in transit, but so are messages sent by carrier pigeon in a hurricane. Your children are looking out the window at what should be a winter wonderland, but looks more like the surface of a hostile alien planet. They're asking when they can go outside and play, and you're doing the parental math of explaining that outside has temporarily become synonymous with certain death. The fireplace that was supposed to provide cosy Christmas ambience is now working overtime like a single parent during finals week. You're feeding it logs with the desperation of someone trying to keep their phone battery alive during a power outage. But here's the thing about this Christmas blizzard. It's not just ruining your holiday plans. It's writing the opening chapter of a winter that will become legend. Your grandchildren will hear about this Christmas, assuming you survive to have grandchildren, which is starting to feel like an optimistic assumption. You're probably thinking this has to be the worst Christmas ever. The universe is nodding and taking notes, preparing to show you several more months of hold my beer weather events. The snow isn't just accumulating, it's engineering itself into architectural features around your house. The drifts against your north wall are approaching second-story height, essentially giving your house a snow foundation it never asked for. It's like living in an igloo designed by someone who's never seen an igloo, but has strong opinions about structural integrity. Christmas carols seem ironically inappropriate when sung to the soundtrack of wind that sounds like it's auditioning for the role of atmospheric terror in a horror movie. Silent Night becomes deeply sarcastic when the night is anything but silent, filled with the sounds of your house being systematically tested by forces that don't care about holiday traditions. You wake up on January the 1st, 1881, and realise that your New Year's resolution should have been survive until February. January isn't just cold, it's cold with the persistence of spam email and the attitude of a mall kiosk salesperson who won't take no for an answer. The temperature hasn't risen above freezing in weeks, and your thermometer is registering numbers that make you question whether you're still on the same planet where summer exists. It's like living inside a freezer that someone forgot to turn off, except freezers eventually get opened. Listen to the wind reshaping the snowdrifts around your house. It sounds like nature's version of the interior decorating, except the design aesthetic is, let's see how uncomfortable we can make these humans. The drifts change shape nightly like you're living in a snow globe that an angry giant keeps shaking. Here's a fun January fact. In the Dakota Territory, you're experiencing what meteorologists would later classify as a polar vortex on steroids. Your body is burning calories just to keep your organs from freezing, which would be a great weight loss plan if there was actually food to eat. Your woodpile is shrinking faster than your patience. You're rationing logs like they're made of precious metals, which they essentially are when the alternative is freezing to death. Each piece of firewood represents another few hours of not dying, making your woodshed more valuable than a bank vault. The snow isn't just accumulating, it's engineering itself into fortifications around your house. Some drifts are so hard-packed you could carve furniture out of them, if you had the tools and weren't worried about using up precious calories on artistic endeavours. Your daily routine has been simplified to the absolute basics. Keep fire burning, eat something, try not to freeze, repeat. It's like living life on the lowest difficulty setting, except the lowest setting is still nightmare mode, and there are no cheat codes. You venture outside to check on your animals, and immediately understand why polar exploration requires special equipment. The cold hits exposed skin like tiny needles made of liquid nitrogen. Your nose hairs freeze instantly, creating a natural filtration system you never wanted. But here's what's really happening in January 1881. This isn't just bad weather anymore. This is a sustained assault on the concept of human habitation in this region. Nature is asking a very pointed question. Are you sure you belong here? And every day that question gets louder. Your neighbours haven't been seen in days. The smoke from their chimneys is the only evidence that they're still alive, like signal fires from distant civilizations. You're all living within shouting distance of each other, but might as well be on separate continents. The concept of day and night has become academic when you're living in a world that's perpetually grey. The sun exists somewhere above the clouds, but its presence is theoretical rather than practical. You're living in a twilight zone where time is measured by wood consumption rather than clock positions. Your sleep patterns have been completely reorganised around the fire maintenance schedule. Someone has to get up every few hours to add logs, which means nobody gets a full night's sleep. Your family has become a rotating shift operation focused on the single goal of keeping combustion happening. You wake up on a Tuesday in mid-January and realise the school hasn't opened in 2 weeks, not because of a teacher's strike or budget cuts, but because the building has essentially become an ice cave with educational pretensions. The schoolhouse sits at the edge of town like a frozen monument to optimism. The idea that children could safely travel to school in this weather is about as practical as opening an ice cream stand on Mars. The building itself is accumulating so much snow that it's starting to look like a geometric hill. Listen to the wind whistling through the gaps in the schoolhouse walls. It's like nature's way of teaching a lesson about the difference between shelter and actual protection. The building might keep the snow off you, but warmth is optional equipment that wasn't included in the construction budget. Here's what really happened during the schoolhouse blizzards. Children got trapped for days at a time, surviving on whatever food the teacher could scrape together. It was like an unplanned camping trip, except camping implies some element of choice and adequate supplies. The teacher, if there still is one, is probably questioning their career choices with the intensity of someone who signed up to teach reading and arithmetic, not Arctic survival skills. Their lesson plan has been reduced to how to not die of hypothermia, with occasional math problems involving calorie consumption rates. You might remember being young and thinking snow days were the best thing ever. These aren't snow days. These are the concept of formal education has been suspended indefinitely due to the weather trying to kill everyone days. The children who do make it to school arrive looking like tiny explorers returning from failed polar expeditions. Their parents send them with so many layers of clothing that they resemble walking laundry piles with eyes. The school's heating system, a single wood stove that was optimistic when installed, is now expected to heat a room full of snow-covered children while competing with wind that treats the building like a personal wind tunnel. It's like trying to heat the outdoors, which is essentially what's happening. But here's the real schoolhouse crisis. Even when children can get there, the building is so cold that ink freezes in the inkwells. You can't write when your writing materials have turned solid, making education literally impossible. It's like trying to run a computer lab during a power outage. The school books are developing ice crystals between the pages, turning literature into a science experiment about the properties of frozen paper. Shakespeare's sonnets now come with a side of frostbite warnings. You're probably thinking this is just a temporary educational interruption. The school board is having meetings where they stare at each other and ask the questions nobody can answer, like, how exactly do you teach when survival takes up all available mental resources? The children's breath creates so much moisture in the closed schoolroom that it immediately condenses and freezes on the walls, essentially turning education into an ice-making operation. The kids are accidentally creating their own winter weather system inside what's supposed to be a learning environment. Some families have just given up on school entirely and started teaching their children practical skills like fire management and food rationing. The curriculum has been replaced by survival training, which is probably more immediately useful than penmanship under current circumstances. You wake up to the sound of your husband splitting wood in the pre-dawn darkness, and you realise that sound has become the soundtrack of your existence. He's not splitting wood because he enjoys early morning exercise. He's splitting wood because the alternative is having a very cold, very permanent sleep. Your coal supply, which seemed generous in October, is now looking at you with the accusation of someone who trusted a weather forecast. The chunks of coal that remain are being counted like precious gems, because that's essentially what they've become in an economy where heat equals survival. Listen to your neighbours making the same desperate calculations you are. How much fuel per day, how many days until spring, and how much of that math involves optimistic assumptions about when winter might end. Everyone's become a mathematician specialising in thermal economics. Here's the fuel reality of January 1881. The railroad hasn't delivered coal in over a month. Your entire heating infrastructure was based on regular supply deliveries, which is like planning a road trip based on gas stations that don't exist. The modern equivalent would be if Amazon stopped delivering during a zombie apocalypse. You're looking at furniture and wondering about its BTU content. That decorative chair nobody sits in? It's starting to look like 3 hours of warmth. The fancy dining table you saved up for? That's a week of not freezing, which makes it the most practical purchase you've ever made. Your husband has started eyeing the fence posts with the calculating gaze of someone doing thermal triage. Every piece of wood in and around your property has been mentally converted into heat units. The outhouse is looking particularly burnable, though that creates other problems you'd rather not think about. The twisted hay technique that prairie families used is exactly as effective as it sounds, which is to say it burns like paper and provides about as much sustained heat. You're essentially heating your house with elaborate grass, while trying to convince yourself this is a legitimate heating strategy. You venture to your woodshed and find it echoing like a tomb. The wood that took your husband all summer to chop and stack has disappeared into your stove like offerings to a demanding fire god who's developed expensive taste. But here's what the fuel crisis really means. You're not just cold, you're trapped in a house that's slowly becoming an icebox despite your best efforts. Every day you're making choices between immediate warmth and long-term survival, like playing a resource management game where losing means death. Your children are wearing every piece of clothing they own simultaneously, creating tiny human layer cakes who can barely move their arms. They look like they're dressed for a space walk, which isn't far from the truth considering the hostile environment outside. The irony is thick enough to cut. You're surrounded by an endless prairie, but every piece of burnable material has to be either purchased, chopped, or scavenged. It's like being thirsty in the middle of an ocean, except instead of salt water, you're surrounded by frozen grass and regret. The hay twisting process has become a family activity, like the world's most desperate craft project. Everyone sits around the kitchen table rolling prairie grass into tight bundles, creating fuel that burns fast and hot but disappears quicker than hope in a budget meeting. It's like manufacturing your own disappointment, one handful of grass at a time. Your neighbours have started organising wood-sharing cooperatives, which sounds very community-minded until you realise it's basically people pooling their resources, to fail collectively rather than individually. Everyone's agreeing to burn through their supplies at the same rate, creating equality and desperation. You wake up on February the 2nd and immediately know that Punxsutawney Phil would take one look outside, have an existential crisis, and consider early retirement. This isn't just Groundhog Day, it's Groundhog Nightmare, where every day is exactly the same except somehow worse. The blizzard that hits in early February makes all the previous storms look like gentle snow flurries. This is snow with attitude, wind with their personal vendettas, and cold that feels like it's been specifically designed to make you question every life choice that brought you to this frozen corner of hell. Listen to the wind reaching frequencies that to make your house sound like a giant musical instrument being played by an angry deity. The walls are creaking not just from the cold, but from the sustained assault of wind that's been blowing at hurricane speeds for days. Here's a February reality check. This blizzard dumps over 6 inches of snow in Omaha alone, and that's the civilized part of the region. Where you are in the Dakota Territory, the snow is measuring itself in feet rather than inches, creating drifts that reach second-story windows. Your food situation has progressed from concerning to mathematically terrifying. You're rationing meals like a submarine crew that's lost contact with the surface, except submarine crews know approximately when their situation will improve. The wheat you've been saving for seed is starting to look less like next year's crop and more like this month's survival plan. You're doing mental calculations that would make an accountant weep. Calories per grain, days remaining until spring, and the increasingly likely possibility that spring is a myth you invented to cope with despair. Your coffee mill has become the most important appliance in your house, grinding wheat kernels into flour with the efficiency of desperation. It's like having the personal grain processing facility, except it's the size of a bread box and makes sounds like it's also questioning its life choices. You look outside and realise that outside no longer exists as a practical concept. There's just inside the house and the frozen wasteland that used to be the world. The distinction between ground and sky has been erased by the horizontal snow that's essentially redesigned physics. But here's what this February blizzard really represents. It's nature's way of asking if you'd like to formally surrender. Every previous storm was practice. This one is the final exam, and it's open book except all the books are frozen solid and the classroom is trying to kill you. You animals have entered a state that can only be described as philosophical resignation. They've stopped fighting the weather and started enduring it with the patience of creatures who have realised that complaining won't change the temperature. The silence between wind gusts has become profound in a way that makes you understand why solitary confinement is considered torture. It's not just quiet, it's the absence of everything that usually indicates life is happening somewhere. This blizzard lasts for 4 days straight, creating a temporal prison where day and night become meaningless concepts. You're living in a continuous loop of wind, snow and cold that feels like being trapped in a weather machine that someone forgot to turn off. The snow doesn't just fall, it moves horizontally with the determination of frozen projectiles seeking targets. Looking outside is like staring into static on an old television, except the static is made of ice crystals and has the power to kill you if you step into it. You wake up to the sound of grinding wheat and realise your kitchen has been transformed into the world's most depressing bakery. The coffee mill that used to handle a few beans for your morning cup is now working overtime like a gig economy worker during Christmas season. Your husband is grinding wheat with the mechanical persistence of someone who's discovered that stopping means starving. The rhythmic sound has become your household's heartbeat, grinding wheat to make flour, mixing flour with water, creating what can generously be called bread if you're feeling optimistic about definitions. Listen to the metal-on-grain sound echoing through your house. It's like having a tiny industrial revolution happening on your kitchen table, except instead of advancing civilization, You're just trying to create something edible from cattle feed. Here's the wheat reality of February 1881. You're eating seed grain, which is like burning your furniture to stay warm while sitting in a house you haven't finished building yet. Every grain you consume is one less potential plant next spring, assuming spring exists and you survive to plant anything. The bread you're making from hand-ground wheat has the texture of disappointed sand and the flavour of regret mixed with prairie grass. Your children are eating it with the enthusiasm of people taking medicine, because that's essentially what it is, medicine against starvation. Your neighbours are going through the same wheat grinding routine, creating a neighbourhood soundtrack of desperate food preparation. Everyone's kitchen has been converted into a survival processing centre, like an entire town of people suddenly deciding to cosplay as medieval peasants. The irony of grinding seed wheat in a coffee mill is not lost on you. You're using equipment designed for luxury beverages to create subsistence nutrition. It's like using a sports car to haul firewood, except the sports car is your only vehicle and firewood is your only source of heat. You're mixing the ground wheat with water that you've had to melt from snow, creating a paste that barely qualifies as food. The cooking process involves more hope than actual culinary technique. You're essentially making edible desperation cookies. But here's what the wheat grinding really represents. You've crossed the line from having a hard winter to actively consuming your future. Every turn of that coffee mill handle is turning next year's crop into today's survival meal. It's like eating your own seed money, literally. Your children are starting to look at the coffee mill with the familiarity of people who've accepted that weird sounds mean food is being created. They've learned to associate the grinding noise with the possibility of not being hungry, which is probably not the childhood memory you were hoping to create. The wheat kernels themselves seem to be getting smaller and fewer, like they're personally offended by being processed in equipment designed for completely different purposes. You're asking agricultural products to perform outside their job description, and they are responding with passive resistance. The grinding process takes hours for enough flour to make one small loaf, turning food preparation into a full-time job that produces results measured in survival rather than satisfaction. Your entire day revolves around the coffee mill's capacity and your arm's endurance, creating a production schedule based on human limitations rather than hunger schedules. Your children have learned to take turns at the coffee mill, turning survival into a family activity that teaches valuable lessons about cooperation, resource management, and why we don't waste food, assuming there's food to waste, which there isn't. You wake up to the most beautiful sound you've heard in months. Human voices that aren't coming from inside your own house. Two figures are approaching through the snow and they're carrying something that looks suspiciously like it might be actual food. Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland look like they've been through a battle with winter itself and somehow managed to achieve a draw. They're covered in so much snow and ice that they resemble walking snowmen who have decided to take up heroic questing as a hobby. Listen to the sound of hope creeping back into your voice as you realise these two young men have somehow found wheat. Not the seed wheat you've been grinding in desperation, but actual, intended for eating wheat that represents the difference between survival and becoming a cautionary tale about frontier living. Here's what really happened. Almanzo and Cap travelled 12 miles through blizzard conditions to find a farmer who had wheat to sell. 12 miles in 1881 winter conditions is like travelling to another dimension where physics work differently and survival is optional. They are telling the story of their journey with the casual tone of people describing a trip to the grocery store, except their grocery store was only accessible through a landscape that was actively trying to murder them. They speak of getting lost, nearly freezing, and finding the wheat like it's all part of a regular Tuesday's adventure. Your neighbours are gathering around these two like they're distributing autographs instead of grain. Everyone's got the same expression of people who've just been told that yes, food still exists somewhere in the universe, and no, they're not hallucinating from hunger-induced delirium. The wheat they're selling isn't cheap. Nothing is cheap when the alternative is starvation, but it's available, which makes it more valuable than gold. Your husband is calculating how much wheat versus how much money with the intensity of someone solving calculus problems where wrong answers equal death. You're looking at these two young men and realising they've just become the closest thing to superheroes your town has ever seen. They didn't get bit by radioactive spiders, they just had the audacity to travel through impossible weather to find food. In 1881, that's essentially the same thing as having superpowers. But here's what makes this moment legendary. They're not keeping the wheat for themselves. They're selling it to whoever needs it, at fair prices, despite having risked their lives to get it. It's like finding someone giving away Wi-Fi passwords during an internet outage. Technically business, but practically heroism. The wheat itself looks like it's been blessed by agricultural angels. Each grain represents not just nutrition, but the possibility that you might actually see spring without having to explain to your children why the seed grain supply is now part of their digestive system. Your town is about to learn that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear heavy coats and have the practical sense to know where farmers store extra wheat during impossible winters. The story of their journey spreads through town faster than gossip at a church social. 12 miles through whiteout conditions, following wagon ruts they couldn't see, using fence posts as navigation markers, and somehow finding a farmer who was willing to sell wheat when most people were hoarding every grain for their own survival. They describe getting lost in a ground blizzard where you can't see your own hand in front of your face, having to feel along fence lines to maintain direction, and spending hours in conditions that would challenge modern survival experts with GPS and satellite phones. They did it with nothing but determination and the knowledge that people were depending on them. You wake up on March 1st and realise that the calendar is either lying to you or has developed a cruel sense of humour. According to mathematics, spring should be arriving soon. According to the thermometer outside your window, mathematics is apparently optional in the Dakota Territory. March is supposed to bring hope, warmer weather, and the gradual return of life to the prairie. Instead, March 1881 brings more snow, continued cold, and the growing suspicion that seasons are just suggestions that nature has decided to ignore indefinitely. Listen to the wind that sounds, exactly like it did in January. Not similar to January. Exactly like January, as if time has gotten stuck in a loop and winter has decided to just keep playing the same song forever. Your house is creaking with the same rhythm it's maintained for months, like a frozen metronome keeping time for a winter that refuses to end. Here's a fun March fact. In normal years, you'd be seeing the first signs of snowmelt and maybe even some brave plants poking through the ground. This year, March looks like January's evil twin who's decided to cosplay as February. The snow isn't melting, it's just accumulating with the persistence of someone who really enjoys overstaying their welcome. Your mental state has evolved beyond simple despair into something more philosophical. You're not just cold and hungry anymore, you're existentially questioning whether warmth is real or just a shared delusion you've been maintaining to cope with permanent winter. The animals have reached a state of Zen acceptance that would impress Buddhist monks. Your chickens have stopped looking hopefully towards spring and started treating eternal winter as their new baseline reality. They've essentially shrugged their feathers and decided that if this is life now, they'll adapt. Your fuel situation has moved beyond critical into whatever category comes after critical. You're burning things that were never intended as fuel, making creative choices about what constitutes burnable that would horrify fire safety experts if fire safety experts existed and weren't also busy burning their own furniture. You look at your calendar and realise it's been 5 months since the first October blizzard. 5 months of winter that shows no signs of acknowledging that it's supposed to end eventually. You're living in a season that's developed separation anxiety and refuses to leave. But here's what March 1881 really represents. It's the month when optimism goes to die. Every previous month you could tell yourself that winter would end soon. March is when soon becomes a meaningless concept and you start to wonder if you have accidentally moved to the North Pole without realising it. Your neighbours have stopped talking about spring like it's an upcoming event and started discussing it like a religious concept that requires faith rather than meteorological evidence. Spring has become theoretical, like advanced mathematics or the possibility of ever being warm again. The seed packets you bought in optimistic moments before winter started are sitting in your kitchen like museum artifacts from a civilization that believed in the concept of growing seasons. You look at the pictures of vegetables on the packages and wonder if those images were just artistic interpretations rather than photographs of real things. Your children ask when they'll be able to play outside without wearing every piece of clothing they own, and you realise you don't have an answer that doesn't sound like you're making up stories about mythical seasons where the air doesn't hurt your face. You wake up and immediately begin the daily calculation that's become more familiar than prayer. How much food remains versus how many days until the theoretical arrival of spring. The math is getting increasingly creative as the numbers get increasingly desperate. Your pantry, which used to contain actual food varieties, now looks like a minimalist art installation titled The Essential Basics of Not Dying. You've got potatoes that are starting to look like they're questioning their life choices, and flour that's being rationed like it's made of powdered gold. Listen to your stomach having philosophical discussions with your brain about the difference between hungry and starving. Your body has recalibrated its expectations so thoroughly that feeling slightly satisfied after a meal has become a notable event worthy of celebration. Hence the brutal math of March 1881. A normal winter food supply was calculated to last from October to April. This winter started in October and is showing no signs of ending by April, which means you're essentially being asked to make 5 months of food last for 7 months. It's like being told to make your phone battery last twice as long by wanting it more. You're eating one meal a day and calling it intermittent fasting like it's a lifestyle choice rather than a survival necessity. Your children are learning to appreciate food in ways that it would make nutritionists weep. They're grateful for anything edible, regardless of taste, texture, or whether it was originally intended for human consumption. The wheat you bought from Almanzo and Cap is being divided into portions so small they require magnifying equipment to see properly. Each grain is being treated like a precious resource, because that's exactly what it is when the alternative is discovering what the inside of your own house tastes like. Your cooking has become incredibly creative in the way that desperation makes everyone an inventor. You're combining ingredients that have never been combined in the history of cuisine, creating dishes that would either revolutionize cooking or violate several international treaties about human rights. You find yourself looking at your seed potatoes, the ones saved for spring planting, with the calculating gaze of someone solving moral dilemmas in real time. Each potato represents a choice between eating today and having food to grow next year, assuming next year exists and isn't just another theoretical concept. But here's what the food mathematics really reveals. You're not just hungry, you're living in a continuous state of resource management that would challenge professional logistics experts. Every meal decision is essentially playing chess with starvation, and starvation is getting better at the game. Your neighbours are making the same impossible choices, creating a community of people who understand the caloric content of items that were never meant to be food. Everyone's become an expert in survival nutrition, like an entire town of people suddenly earning degrees in famine management. The irony of being surrounded by thousands of acres of farmland while slowly starving is not lost on you. You're essentially starving in the middle of one of the world's most fertile regions, because fertility means nothing when everything is frozen under 3 feet of snow and the growing season is a myth. Your daily food preparation has been reduced to the absolute basics. Take whatever you have, make it last as long as possible, and try to extract maximum nutrition from minimum resources. It's like being a restaurant chef specialising in impossible challenges, except the customers are your own family and the consequence of failure is death. The children have learned to eat slowly, not because they're practicing mindful eating, but because making meals last longer creates the illusion of having eaten more. They've developed survival psychology without realising it, turning food scarcity into a game they can win through patience and appreciation. You wake up and for a moment can't remember what day it is, what month it is, or whether time is still functioning normally. The endless sameness of winter days has created a temporal fog where every day feels exactly like the previous day, creating a psychological Groundhog Day scenario that's slowly driving everyone insane. Your mental state has evolved through several distinct phases: initial optimism, growing concern, active worry, desperate calculation, and now something that can only be described as functional acceptance of potential doom. You're not depressed exactly, you're just mathematically realistic about your survival odds. Listen to the silence in your house between conversations. It's not comfortable silence, it's the silence of people who are conserving mental energy for survival tasks and have temporarily given up on recreational thinking. Your family has become a survival unit rather than a social group. Here's what 5 months of winter isolation does to the human brain. It essentially rewires your priorities down to the absolute basics. You're not thinking about hopes, dreams, or future poor plans. You're thinking about fuel management, calorie distribution, and whether the strange sound the wind just made indicates a structural problem with your house. Your children have stopped asking when winter will end and have started asking more immediate questions like whether the strange taste in the water means it's still safe to drink. They've adapted to crisis mode with the resilience of people who don't yet understand how unusual their situation is. The social dynamics of your tiny community have shifted into something resembling a lifeboat scenario. Everyone's polite because conflict wastes energy, but underneath the politeness is the constant awareness that resources are finite and spring is hypothetical. You find yourself having conversations with inanimate objects, not because you've lost your mind, but because human interaction has become so precious that you're subconsciously trying to create more of it. The coffee mill gets thanked for grinding wheat. The stove gets encouraged to burn more efficiently. You've essentially started treating your house like a team member in your survival effort. Your dreams have become either anxiety nightmares about running out of food, or impossibly pleasant fantasies about warm weather and abundant meals. Your subconscious is either torturing you with worst-case scenarios, or providing psychological relief through scenarios so optimistic they're basically science fiction. But here's what the psychological toll really means. You're living in a state of sustained crisis that's rewiring your brain's definition of normal. Warmth, adequate food, and reliable fuel have become extraordinary luxuries rather than basic expectations. You're essentially being retrained to appreciate things that civilized life takes for granted. Your sense of time has been completely reorganized around survival tasks. Days are measured not by clock time but by fuel consumption, meal schedules, and the endless cycle of staying warm enough to stay alive. You've developed your own calendar based on degrees of desperation rather than traditional date systems. The most disturbing part might be how normal this has started to feel. The crisis has lasted so long that you're beginning to adapt to it as your new baseline reality, which is probably a necessary psychological defense mechanism, but also suggests that your brain has given up on the concept of this situation ever improving. Your conversations with neighbours have been reduced to essential information exchange: who has what resources, who needs what help, and whether anyone's heard any news about when conditions might improve. Social chat has been suspended in favour of survival networking, turning human relationships into resource management systems. The children have developed their own coping mechanisms, creating games out of survival tasks and finding entertainment in activities that would have bored them senseless before the crisis. They've learned to appreciate small pleasures with the intensity of people who understand that pleasure is no longer guaranteed. You wake up on April 1st and wonder if the universe is playing an elaborate April Fool's joke that involves making you think spring might actually exist. The calendar insists it's spring, but the thermometer outside your window is clearly participating in some kind of cosmic prank, where numbers below freezing are considered acceptable in what should be the growing season. April is supposed to be about renewal, hope, and the return of life to the prairie. Instead, April out of 1881 is serving up more winter, with the persistence of a dinner guest who doesn't understand social cues about when the party is over. The snow is still falling like it's December, but now it feels personally insulting because it's supposed to be spring. Listen to the wind that still sounds like it's auditioning for a horror movie soundtrack. After 6 months, you've learned to identify different types of wind by sound. There's regular threatening wind, structural damage wind, and existential crisis wind. This morning's wind is firmly in the existential crisis category. Here's an April reality check. Normal years in the Dakota Territory see snow melting, ground softening, and maybe even some brave plants starting to emerge. This year, April looks like winter's greatest hits album, playing all the classics with the same intensity as January, but with added psychological damage, because it's happening when nature is supposed to be waking up. Your animals have reached a state of seasonal confusion that would be funny if it weren't so tragic. The chickens are looking around like they've been promised a party that keeps getting postponed indefinitely. They've developed the 1,000-yard stare of creatures who've given up on understanding how seasons are supposed to work. The seed packets you optimistically ordered for spring planting are sitting in your house like decorative reminders of concepts that may not actually exist. Planting anything in the current conditions would be like trying to start a garden on the moon. Technically possible, but requiring technology and conditions you don't currently have access to. Your mental preparation for spring, the planning, the hope, the gradual psychological shift from survival mode to growth mode, has been completely derailed. It's like getting ready for a vacation that keeps getting cancelled at the last minute, except the vacation is not dying of cold and hunger. You look outside at what should be your garden plot and see nothing but snow-covered wasteland stretching to the horizon. The ground is still frozen solid enough to require industrial equipment to penetrate, assuming industrial equipment existed and wasn't also frozen solid. But here's what April 1881 really represents. It's the month when hope becomes a form of psychological torture. Every day that passes without improvement is another day of realizing that your assumptions about how the world works might be fundamentally flawed. Maybe winter doesn't end. Maybe this is just how life is now. Your neighbours have stopped making optimistic comments about the weather and started making dark jokes about moving somewhere with a more reasonable climate, like the Arctic Circle or the surface of Mars. Everyone's humour has evolved to match the situation. Dark, practical, and focused on scenarios nobody wants to think about. The most psychologically challenging aspect is that April should feel different, but it doesn't. The light is changing, the days are getting longer, but the temperature and snow conditions remain identical to the worst parts of January. It's like being promised that your circumstances are improving while everything around you provides evidence to the contrary. Your children keep asking when they can plant the garden, and you realise you've been giving them the same soon answer for weeks. They're starting to look at you with the suspicious expression of people who've figured out that adult promises might not be as reliable as previously advertised. You wake up to what sounds like rain on your roof and for one glorious moment think that winter is finally surrendering. Then you realise it's just snow melting and refreezing in an endless cycle that's essentially Mother Nature's way of showing you that she's mastered the art of false hope. The temperature keeps teasing the freezing point like a lottery ticket that almost wins but never quite pays out. It gets just warm enough to make you think progress is happening, then drops back down to remind you that progress is optional, and optimism is a luxury you can't afford. Listen to the sound of melting snow creating tiny waterfalls off your roof, only to watch it freeze again before it hits the ground. It's like nature is demonstrating the concept of futility through experimental ice sculpture that changes every few hours. Here's what's happening meteorologically. You're experiencing a phenomenon that would later be called freeze-thaw cycles. But in 1881, you just call it weather that can't make up its mind about whether it wants to kill you quickly or slowly. The constant temperature changes are creating conditions that are somehow worse than just staying consistently cold. Your house is developing ice formations in places where ice has no business existing. Icicles are growing inside your windows, creating interior decorating that's both beautiful and deeply concerning. You're essentially living in an ice sculpture that occasionally remembers it's supposed to be providing shelter. The melting snow is creating mud that exists for approximately 30 minutes before freezing into ice that's somehow more treacherous than the original snow. Walking outside has become like navigating a skating rink designed by someone with a grudge against human mobility. Your animals are experiencing the same psychological whiplash you are. They venture outside when it seems warm, then retreat with the betrayed expression of creatures who've been lied to by their own instincts. Even the animals have trust issues with the weather at this point. The false thaw is creating drainage problems that would challenge civil engineers. Water is melting, flowing to low areas, and then freezing again, creating ice dams that redirect the next melt in completely unpredictable directions. Your yard is becoming an abstract art installation titled Chaos Theory in Frozen Water. But here's what the non-thaw really means. It's worse than just staying cold. The constant temperature changes are playing with your psychology, offering hope and then snatching it away like a cosmic bully. It's weather that's actively messing with your mental health through environmental gaslighting. You find yourself checking the thermometer obsessively, like checking your phone for messages that never come. Every degree above freezing feels like progress. Every drop back below freezing feels like personal defeat. You've developed an emotional relationship with temperature readings that's probably not healthy. The most frustrating part is that the slight warming makes the cold feel worse when it returns. After getting used to temperatures that are merely brutal, going back to temperatures that are actively hostile feels like twice the punishment. It's like adjusting to the prison food and then being served worse prison food. The puddles that form during the brief warm periods become tiny frozen lakes that serve no purpose except to remind you that water exists in liquid form somewhere in the universe. They're like museum exhibits showcasing a physical state of matter that's become theoretical in your current reality. Your daily routine now includes checking for signs of actual thaw versus false thaw, making you a reluctant expert in ice formation patterns and temperature trends. You've developed skills in winter meteorology that you never wanted and will hopefully never need again, assuming this ever ends. You wake up to the absence of a sound you've been hoping to hear for months, the train whistle that would signal the return of civilization, supplies, and the possibility that the outside world still remembers your town exists. The silence where that whistle should be is becoming as familiar as your own heartbeat. The railroad tracks, which used to represent connection to the broader world, now look like abstract art installations titled Optimism buried under impossible amounts of snow. The rails are somewhere under drifts that have achieved architectural status, creating snow formations that would impress city planners if city planners were interested in designing obstacles to human transportation. Listen to your neighbours discussing the railroad situation with the tone of people debating whether unicorns might be real. The train has become a mythical concept, like electricity or indoor plumbing, something that exists in theory but not in your current practical reality. Here's the railroad reality of April 1881. The companies have essentially given up trying to clear the tracks and are waiting for spring to melt the problem away. It's like calling tech support and being told to turn winter off and back on again, except winter's power button is controlled by forces beyond human influence. The supply situation has moved beyond desperate into whatever category exists when desperate looks optimistic by comparison. Your general store looks like it's been decorated by minimalist artists who believe that empty shelves represent the purest form of retail expression. Your town has been operating as an isolated island for so long that you've developed your own economy based on bartering services and supplies that would make anthropologists study you as an example of primitive resource sharing. Money still exists, but its practical value has been superseded by the exchange rate of firewood for food. The mail hasn't arrived in months, which means your connection to family and friends in other places has been severed as completely as if you'd moved to another planet. Letters are accumulating somewhere east of here, like messages in bottles floating in an ocean of snow. You're starting to understand how pioneer communities developed such strong local bonds, not just out of friendliness, but out of the practical necessity of survival when the outside world becomes temporarily unavailable. Your neighbours aren't just neighbours anymore. They're your entire social and economic universe. But here's what the railroad situation really means. You're living in a temporary return to pre-industrial isolation that's teaching you exactly how dependent your lifestyle was on transportation technology you'd never thought about. The train wasn't just convenient, it was the technological lifeline that made your location habitable. Your children are asking questions about when the train will come back, and you're realizing you don't have answers that don't sound like wishful thinking. You're essentially telling them that yes, trains exist, but they live in a different dimension where physics work more reliably than they do here. The most psychologically challenging part might be that you can see the railroad tracks. They're right there under the stew, but they might as well be on the moon for all the good they're doing you. It's like having a car with no gas stations, or a phone with no service, or a bridge that leads to nowhere because the other side has been temporarily removed by weather. The railroad companies are probably having board meetings somewhere warm, looking at maps and discussing the Dakota Territory situation like it's a minor inconvenience rather than a complete breakdown of the system that makes frontier life possible. They're treating your survival crisis like a scheduling problem that will resolve itself eventually. Your connection to the broader economy has been severed so completely that you're essentially living in a different century, relying on skills and systems that your grandparents would recognize, but that modern convenience has made obsolete. You're getting a crash course in pre-industrial living that you never signed up for. You wake up on May the 12th, and for the first time in 7 months, you don't immediately start calculating fuel consumption and calorie ratios. The air coming through your window doesn't feel like it's been specifically designed to cause frostbite. Something has fundamentally changed, and it takes your brain several minutes to process that the change might actually be positive. The temperature is above freezing and staying there, like it's finally remembered its job description and decided to start taking it seriously. Your thermometer is showing numbers that seem almost fictional after months of readings that suggested you were living in a climate suitable only for polar bears and people with serious personality disorders. Listen to the sound of water running. Actual liquid water, moving downhill like water is supposed to do, instead of turning wild gears and creating abstract sculptures around your house. It's the sound of physics working normally again, which has become so unusual that it's almost startling. Here's what's happening in May 1881. The spring thaw isn't gradual and gentle like normal years. It's sudden and dramatic, like nature apologising for being late to its own party and trying to make up for lost time by doing everything at once. The snow isn't melting, it's evacuating. Your animals are experiencing their own version of psychological rehabilitation. The chickens are venturing outside with the cautious optimism of prisoners being released after a very long sentence. They're pecking at the ground like they're not entirely sure it's real and might disappear again at any moment. The ground underneath the melting snow looks like it's been through a war, which it essentially has. Dead grass, debris that's been frozen in place for months, and patches of earth that look surprised to be visible again create a landscape that's part archaeological excavation, part crime scene. Your neighbours are emerging from their houses like hibernating bears, blinking in the sunlight and moving with the stiff uncertainty of people who've forgotten how to function in non-survival mode. Everyone's had the same thought. Is this real, or is it another false thaw designed to torture us psychologically? The seed packets that have been sitting in your house all winter are suddenly relevant again. You're looking at them with the amazement of someone who's rediscovered buried treasure. Except the treasure is the possibility of growing food instead of grinding coffee beans into survival paste. But here's what the sudden warmth really represents. It's not just weather changing, it's the return of hope as a practical emotion rather than a theoretical concept. For the first time in months, planning for the future feels like something other than an exercise in wishful thinking. Your daily routine, which has been focused entirely on immediate survival tasks, suddenly has room for activities beyond staying alive. You can think about things like cleaning, organising, and maybe even activities that serve purposes other than preventing death. The psychological shift is almost disorienting. After months of crisis mode, your brain doesn't quite know how to process the possibility that the crisis might be ending. It's like being told that the test you've been taking for 7 months is finally over, but you're not sure if you passed or failed. The sound of melting snow is everywhere, dripping from roofs running in tiny streams, pooling in low areas, creating a symphony of liquid water that sounds like the most beautiful music you've ever heard. It's the soundtrack of winter's surrender. Psan! In the key of relief and hope. Your children are asking if they can go outside without wearing every piece of clothing they own. And you realise you're not sure how to answer, because the concept of comfortable outdoor temperature has become so foreign that you've forgotten what it feels like to make weather-based clothing decisions that aren't life or death choices. You wake up to the sound of rushing water and for a moment panic, thinking your house is flooding. Then you realise that yes, everything is flooding, but it's the kind of flooding that means winter is finally surrendering rather than the kind that means your roof is leaking. The distinction is important when you've been waiting 7 months for any sign that the world might return to normal operation. The snow is melting so fast it's like watching time-lapse photography of geological change. Drifts that took months to accumulate are disappearing in days, creating rivers where none existed before and turning your familiar landscape into something that looks like it's been designed by water engineers with attention deficit disorder. Listen to the sound of civilization returning. Water flowing, birds chirping, and in the distance the most beautiful sound you've heard in months. A train whistle. The railroad has finally managed to clear enough track to attempt deliveries, like a supply chain that has been in a coma finally waking up and remembering its job. Here's what the spring flood of 1881 really means. All that snow has to go somewhere, and it's going there all at once. Rivers are swelling beyond their banks, creating impromptu lakes in places that were never supposed to be underwater. It's like the prairie is taking a very large, very overdue shower. Your town is experiencing both the joy of warmth returning and the chaos of dealing with water management issues that would challenge modern city planners. Streets are becoming temporary streams, and everyone's suddenly become amateur hydrologists trying to direct water flow away from their foundations. The flooding is revealing things that have been buried under snow for months. Tools you'd given up for lost, fence posts you'd forgotten existed, and occasionally livestock that didn't make it through the winter. It's like an archaeological dig combined with a very wet treasure hunt. Your animals are having mixed reactions to the flood situation. They're happy to be warm, but confused by the sudden abundance of water everywhere. The chickens are looking at puddles like they're trying to remember what liquid water is supposed to be used for. The train's arrival brings more than just supplies. It brings proof that the outside world still exists and remembers that you exist too. The conductor looks like he's seen combat, which in the way he has, fighting a 7-month battle against snowdrifts that treated railroad tracks like suggestions. rather than infrastructure. But here's what the flood really represents. It's nature's way of clearing the slate and starting over. All the evidence of the brutal winter, the ice, the snow, the accumulated misery, is being washed away like a reset button for the entire prairie ecosystem. Your mental state is undergoing its own flood of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, gratitude, and a weird form of survivor's guilt are all mixing together like the muddy water currently redesigning your landscape. You survived something that felt unsurvivable, and your brain isn't quite sure how to process that accomplishment. The irony isn't lost on you that you're now dealing with too much water after spending months worried about not having enough of everything else. It's like the weather has overcorrected from trying to kill you with cold to trying to rearrange your entire environment with enthusiastic hydration. The children are fascinated by the rushing water, having forgotten that water could move and make sounds and create its own geography. They're treating the flood like entertainment, which it essentially is after months of entertainment consisting of try not to freeze to death, and practice being grateful for food that tastes terrible. Your first priority is protecting your house from flood damage, but your second priority is just standing outside in the warm air and remembering what it feels like to breathe without pain. The simple act of being outdoors without comprehensive protective equipment feels like a luxury you'd forgotten existed. You wake up to warm air and the realization that you need to take inventory, not just of your physical supplies, but of what this winter has cost you and what it has surprisingly given you in return. The accounting is more complex than simple math because some losses can't be measured in numbers and some gains weren't expected when you started this ordeal. Your food stores are essentially empty, your fuel supplies are completely exhausted, and your house looks like it's been through a siege, which it essentially has. But you're alive, your family is alive, and your neighbours are alive, which given the circumstances feels like a mathematical miracle. Listen to the sounds of a community beginning to rebuild. Hammers fixing winter damage, voices discussing planting schedules, and the general buzz of people who've remembered that life includes activities beyond survival. Everyone's moving with the slightly stunned efficiency of people who can't quite believe they made it through. Here's the brutal accounting of the long winter. Livestock losses across the territory were devastating. Many families consumed their seed grain and will struggle to plant crops, and some homesteaders simply abandoned their claims and headed back east. The mortality rate wasn't just about people. Entire dreams of frontier life died during those 7 months. Your children have learned lessons about resourcefulness, resilience, and the difference between wants and needs that most people never learn. They've seen their parents make impossible decisions and somehow find solutions, which is either character building or mildly traumatic depending on your perspective on childhood education. The community bonds forged during the crisis are stronger than anything that could have been created during normal times. You know your neighbours in ways that only happen when you've all faced potential death together and chosen to help each other rather than compete for resources. Your relationship with weather has been permanently altered. You'll never again assume that seasons will behave according to expectations, and you'll never take warm weather, adequate food, or reliable fuel delivery for granted. You've been educated in the difference between modern convenience and historical reality. The skills you've developed, from food preservation and fuel management to community resource sharing and creative problem solving, are the kind of practical knowledge that most people have forgotten in the rush toward modern convenience. You've essentially earned a degree in frontier survival under the worst possible circumstances, but here's what the victory really looks like. It's not dramatic or Hollywood-worthy. It's simply the quiet satisfaction of having faced an impossible situation and found a way through it. You've learned that humans are more resilient than they think. Communities are stronger than individuals, and spring always comes eventually, even when it seems like a myth. Your house needs repairs, your finances need rebuilding, and your land needs replanting. But these are problems of renewal rather than problems of survival, which makes them feel manageable rather than existential. You're dealing with the challenges of living rather than the challenge of staying alive. The story you'll tell your grandchildren won't focus on the suffering, it will focus on the ingenuity, the community spirit, and the simple miracle of human persistence in the face of conditions that seem designed to prove that humans don't belong on the prairie. But you do belong here, because you stayed and you survived and you're still here to tell the story. the financial cost will take years to recover from. The seed grain you ate needs to be replaced, the livestock losses need to be rebuilt, and the fuel debt you accumulated will require careful budgeting. But these are problems with solutions, unlike the problem of how do you survive impossible weather, which you already solved. Your children are already making plans for summer activities and fall preparations, having learned that seasonal planning is serious business rather than casual optimism. They're talking about next winter like experienced strategists rather than children, which is probably healthy, but also makes you realize how much they had to grow up during those 7 months. The most important inventory isn't of supplies or losses, but of what you learned about yourselves and your community under extreme pressure. You discovered that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to, that neighbours can become family when survival depends on cooperation, and that human beings are capable of enduring far more than they think they can. You wake up in the modern era and realise that Laura Ingalls Wilder wasn't just telling a story about one bad winter. She was documenting what happens when all the systems we depend on suddenly stop working. Her Long Winter wasn't historical fiction. It was a survival manual disguised as a children's book. The winter of 1880-1881 tested every assumption about how human settlements work on the Great Plains. It proved that railroad-dependent towns were essentially artificial life support systems that could be turned off by weather. It demonstrated that the difference between civilization and survival is often just a functioning supply chain and a reliable transportation. Listen to the modern world humming around you: heating systems, supply deliveries, weather forecasts, emergency services, and realize that Laura's family survived without any of these safety nets. They faced 7 months of conditions that would challenge modern emergency management systems using nothing but community cooperation and individual resourcefulness. Here's what the Long Winter teaches us about resilience. It's not about individual toughness or heroic gestures. It's about community networks, shared resources, practical skills, and the ability to adapt expectations when circumstances change. Laura's family survived because their entire community chose cooperation over competition when a survival was at stake. The modern equivalent would be like your city losing power, internet, food delivery, and transportation simultaneously for 7 months, with no outside help coming, and no clear timeline for when services would be restored. Most modern communities wouldn't last 7 weeks under those conditions, let alone 7 months. Your ancestors who lived through the Long Winter developed skills that seemed obsolete until recent events reminded us how fragile our supply chains actually are. They knew how to preserve food without refrigeration, heat homes without central systems, and maintain community bonds when individual survival depended on group cooperation. The psychological resilience displayed by frontier families goes beyond what most modern stress management courses even attempt to teach. They faced uncertainty, scarcity, and genuine life or death situations for months at a time, while maintaining the mental clarity needed to make rational decisions about resource allocation and risk management. Laura's writing captures something that academic histories miss: the daily experience of living through impossible circumstances and finding ways to not just survive but maintain human dignity and community bonds. She documented the difference between existing and living, even under the worst possible conditions. But here's what Laura really understood. Extreme situations reveal who people actually are, rather than who they think they are. The Long Winter was a stress test of human character, and the people who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or smartest. They were the ones who could adapt, share resources, and maintain hope when hope seemed irrational. The story she told wasn't about conquering nature or defeating winter through human superiority. It was about learning to work with impossible circumstances, finding creative solutions to unprecedented problems, and discovering that human communities are more resilient than human individuals when everyone commits to collective survival. The practical wisdom embedded in Laura's narrative, from resource management and community cooperation to psychological endurance and creative problem-solving, remains as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. The technologies have changed, but the fundamental challenges of human survival in extreme circumstances remain constant. Modern readers often focus on the hardship and suffering in Laura's account, but the real story is about ordinary people discovering extraordinary capabilities when faced with extraordinary challenges. It's about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom, between individual survival and community resilience. You wake up with the advantage of modern meteorology and realize that the long winter wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of specific atmospheric conditions that created a perfect storm of sustained extreme weather. Scientists now understand exactly why 1880 to 1881 was so brutal, which somehow makes Laura's family's survival even more impressive. The winter was caused by an extremely negative North Atlantic oscillation, combined with a weak El Niño pattern, creating atmospheric conditions that essentially parked Arctic air over the Great Plains for 7 months. It's like the weather got stuck in a loop that kept playing the same frozen song over and over again. Listen to modern weather forecasters talking about polar vortex events, and realise that Laura's family faced a polar vortex that lasted from October to May without modern warning systems, insulated housing, or emergency services. They dealt with weather that makes modern meteorologists nervous using nothing but wood stoves and community cooperation. Here's the scientific reality. The Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index ranks 1880 to 1881 as one of the most severe winters in recorded American history. The temperature component scored maximum points for severity, meaning it was literally off the charts for sustained cold. Modern weather services would issue emergency warnings that would sound like disaster movie scripts. The early October blizzard that started the whole ordeal was meteorologically extraordinary. October blizzards east of the Rocky Mountains are rare enough so that modern forecasters consider them notable events. Laura's family faced one that kicked off 7 months of similar conditions, like being told the opening act of a concert is actually the entire show. The railroad company's failure to keep tracks clear wasn't due to incompetence, it was due to snow conditions that would challenge modern snow removal equipment. The drifts weren't just deep, they were packed hard enough to support the weight of locomotives, creating obstacles that were more like ice walls than snow piles. The spring flood that ended the winter was equally extreme, with rivers reaching record levels that stood for decades. It wasn't just snow melting, it was the equivalent of a winter's worth of precipitation being released all at once across the entire region, creating hydrological chaos that modern flood management systems would struggle to handle. Modern climate science can now predict when conditions similar to 1880 to 1881 might occur again, but the predictions aren't particularly comforting. The specific combination of atmospheric patterns that created the long winter can and will happen again, though thankfully not with the same frequency as normal winter weather. But here's what the science really tells us. Laura's family survived a legitimately extraordinary weather event that ranks among the most severe in North American history. They weren't just dealing with a bad winter, they were dealing with a weather phenomenon that modern meteorologists would classify as a natural disaster lasting 7 months. The data confirms what Laura wrote. This wasn't normal pioneer hardship or typical frontier challenges. This was a sustained extreme weather event that tested the absolute limits of human adaptability and community resilience. The fact that most people survived isn't just impressive, it's scientifically remarkable given the conditions they faced. The atmospheric pressure patterns that created the long winter were so unusual that they've become a case study for climate scientists trying to understand how extreme weather events develop and persist. The winter of 1880 to 1881 wasn't just historically significant, it's scientifically fascinating as an example of how planetary weather systems can sometimes create conditions that challenge human survival. The temperature records from that winter show sustained cold that would trigger modern emergency protocols designed to prevent loss of life. Contemporary weather monitoring systems would have issued continuous severe weather warnings for the entire 7-month period, treating the situation as an ongoing natural disaster requiring emergency response. You wake up in your climate-controlled house and realise that Laura Ingalls Wilder's Long Winter contains more practical wisdom about resilience, community and resource management than most modern self-help books. Her family's survival strategies are essentially a masterclass in crisis management that business schools should study. The resource allocation decisions made by frontier families during the long winter demonstrate principles that apply to any situation where demand exceeds supply and outside help isn't coming. They had to balance immediate needs against long-term survival without knowing when the crisis would end, which is essentially the foundation of all emergency planning. Listen to modern discussions about supply chain disruptions, energy security and community resilience, and realise that Laura's neighbours were implementing solutions to these exact problems using nothing but practical wisdom and social cooperation. They created a functioning local economy based on mutual aid when the global economy temporarily stopped reaching their location. Here's what the long winter teaches about modern emergency preparedness. Individual stockpiling isn't as effective as community resource sharing. Skills matter more than supplies when supplies run out. And psychological resilience is as important as physical resources for long-term survival. The way frontier communities handled the fuel crisis by sharing resources and developing alternative heating methods provides a blueprint for modern communities facing energy shortages. They didn't just ration what they had, they developed creative alternatives and shared both resources and knowledge to maximize everyone's chances of survival. The food preservation and preparation techniques used during the winter, grinding wheat and coffee mills, rationing supplies based on family size and need, creating nutrition from minimal resources, are essentially early versions of modern food security strategies that disaster relief organizations still use today. The psychological strategies Laura's family used to maintain hope and community bonds during extended crisis conditions demonstrate principles that modern trauma counselors and emergency responders recognize as essential for long-term survival in extreme situations. The community decision-making processes that determined how to allocate scarce resources fairly while maintaining social cohesion provide models for how modern communities might handle resource shortages during climate emergencies or infrastructure failures. But here's the most important modern lesson. The long winter succeeded because people chose cooperation over competition when resources became scarce. They shared information, pooled resources, and made collective decisions that prioritize community survival over individual advantage. Modern communities facing similar challenges, whether from natural disasters, economic disruption, or infrastructure failure, could learn from the frontier approach of treating crisis as a community problem requiring community solutions rather than individual problems requiring individual solutions. The long-term recovery from the longs. Winter also provides insights for modern disaster recovery. Communities that maintained social bonds during the crisis recovered faster and more completely than those where social systems broke down under pressure. Laura's story isn't just historical documentation. It's a practical guide to community resilience that remains relevant, because the fundamental challenges of human survival in extreme conditions haven't changed, even if the specific circumstances have evolved. The financial and emotional recovery strategies used by frontier families, rebuilding slowly, maintaining community support networks, and focusing on long-term sustainability rather than quick fixes, offer models for modern communities dealing with the aftermath of crisis situations. Modern technology can provide better warning systems and more efficient resource management, but the basic human elements of survival, community cooperation, resource sharing, psychological resilience, and practical problem solving remain the same as they were during Laura's long winter. So here's the question that Laura Ingalls Wilder's long winter leaves us with. When the systems we depend on stop working, when the weather doesn't follow the rules, when the supply chains break down and outside help isn't coming, who do we become? Laura's family and their neighbours chose to become the kind of people who share their last handful of wheat with hungry children, who risk their lives to find food for their community, and who grind coffee beans into flour rather than give up on survival. They chose to become the kind of people who survive impossible winters and then plant gardens in the spring. Maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Resilience isn't just about having enough supplies or the right equipment. It's about choosing to be the kind of person who keeps trying, keeps helping others, and keeps believing that spring will come eventually, even when winter seems endless. What kind of person would you choose to be? Comment below, and maybe mention what your own long winter has taught you about what really matters when everything else gets stripped away. Like this video if you enjoyed learning about one of the most brutal winters in American history. Subscribe for more deep dives into historical events that shaped the people who came before us, and share your thoughts about community resilience and what we can learn from our ancestors' incredible survival stories.